Ở cái hộp nó. Hình quý. Hình quý đó. Dạo phần số hot here oh my
Good morning, we're going to try to get started.
we have one.
Welcome to NetMod. I know we have some sessions we're conflicting with, so we have less people in the room than normal. Hopefully that means we have better discussions and make it to our agenda. In blue, we have Kent and Joel co-sharing. You'll notice that we have someone in gray. Michael, you're here. So I'd like to thank Michael for helping us as secretary for a number of years, and we really appreciate that. But we also felt that with now that we have 3 chairs, we didn't need a secretary, and it's a little too much there. So Michael is no longer secretary, but we really appreciate all of his help in the past. And we particularly hope that he continues to help us with minute taking this time, even though he no longer has the title of secretary. If you jump onto the tools page and this Etherpad link, you can help us with our joint minute taking. We really appreciate everyone helping out to capture what's being said, and importantly, if you make a comment on the mic, at least go back and check that we appropriately captured your comment and go fix it. You're not allowed to put there anything that you actually didn't say in the session, because of these are minutes. These are. I skipped. Okay, this is why we have a page. I skipped over well. I think folks are pretty familiar with this. This goes to how we govern our process here and how we govern our presentation. And the main takeaway is anything you say here will become part of our recording record. We are recording what we're saying. We're also sending it via Meet Echo. Please use the microphone and state your name when you come to it. Blue sheets are going around, sign them. And these are the usual links for lost our screen up here at the last minute, so we have 2 sessions this time. Thank you for making it to this one. This is obviously the first session. The second session is on Thursday. We have set up the agenda so that we're covering the bulk of the graphs in this session, and then in the next session, we're going to have a lot of discussion on a couple of key topics. Excuse me. So that's not to say that these aren't important. We really want some good discussion on these topics. This was a little bit of a rearrangement from where we were last week, and the real motivation for that is to give enough time for discussions on the last call that we had with Tim. If you are at all interested in the versioning discussion, please come. The requirements document has been a product of the design team, and we really want to make sure we have good agreement in the working group on the requirements
that are documented and make that a working group document. Where we go with that in the long term, we'll figure that out. We'll figure out whether we end up taking it to full RFC or not. The important thing is that by making a working group document, we are getting agreement that those are the requirements that the solution is going to adhere to. So it's a really important discussion. So please come participate in the next session on that. I don't know if you want to go through these. Since, all right, I'll not. So since the last meeting, what's happened? We have one new RFC. That's awesome to actually get an RFC out. And we have 3 that are in the with the ISG for publication. There's been a good amount of discussion on ACL model. Schema mount, I think we're close. That's pretty important to get out. Of course, I'm biased because I worked on that, but it's gating other work. So we really want to make sure that that is finalized. I think there was a request for some feedback from the authors. Is Martin here? I don't know if he's, oh, okay. So Martin, if you are listening, I know there might be an outstanding response necessary on that document. Okay, since the last meeting, we have adopted a few documents and we're going to be talking about them now. I believe the artwork folding has already been republished as a working group document, so it's now draft IETF. We made up these slides before that was done. We expect to see the Yang instance data submitted real soon. Oh, so I just looked at the author and said, you know, when are you going to do your job? And his response was, chairs, you haven't done yours because we have to approve it. So we apologize for that. And that will happen by one of us during this session. This is more just for awareness, general awareness. We have some old liaisons. We didn't get anything new, but it's good to know that these are out there. In particular, the invitation to participate in the monthly conference calls is a pretty substantive invitation. And we wanted to remind the group that that's out there. And if you'd like to join those discussions, particularly if you're interested in the OAM topic, it's an opportunity to contribute to a different group and help align our work with their work or their work with our work. And I guess that's the end because I'm clicking, there's no more. So we're going to move on to the next. You want to try to do that? Do you want me to do that? Just click to the next tab. Yeah. And there's a full screen button. It's a full screen now. Oh, there it is.
Okay. So a quick status update on these 2 drafts. They're effectively almost done, so there's not much more to be said on these.
One at the top.
Is my clicker working? No, just scroll. Okay, so the first draft, the interface, NETMOD interface extensions draft, there's been no update since the last IETF. So I effectively think that this draft is done, so let's comment to the chairs. That I think this draft is done. My question is whether we should hold off progressing this any further until we've got the sub-interface VLAN model done. So I'll just cover that one as well, and then we'll come back to that. So next slide, please. Does it actually work as well?
It should work for you, but
oh, fine. Okay. So the sub-interface VLAN model 1, again, there's been no update since the last IETF. Effectively, this was always done. This is waiting on 2 things. One is the L2PN Yang model. In their structure, the way that they augment the network instance container, they've lost their top-level container. So all the L2PN config sits directly under the network instance. I wasn't quite sure that that was right or not, so I've queried that with them. And that only affects the examples, but I think it'd be good to try and get those examples correct. So the plan, I think, for the L2 model was that it's going to go to working group last call fairly soon in BESS. So I think I'm just waiting on that to close on that issue. And maybe you can get that resolved this week. And then the last one is effectively, there were some changes made to the model to make it simpler. And I wanted to get approval from the IEEE 822.1, it should be 822.1 working group, on those changes. So I've emailed them yesterday, not as a formal liaison, but informally asking them to have a look at that and give comments back. I have had one comment back pointing out a mistake in that model, in one of the when statements and identity. So I will fix that. So there needs to be one update for that. But I'm hoping that effectively once 80.1 agree that they're happy with the changes, then we can go to working group last fall as well. If chairs are happy with that.
We had talked about formalizing that liaison at the last meeting. What do you think? Is the informal adequate, or should we do something more formal? And I'll note that the IEEE is meeting next week. I don't know if there's anything you want to try to accomplish informally. Getting a liaison done in that time might be a little quick, but.
So I think because it's been discussed with them before, I think informal should be fine, unless they come back and say, look, we need this to be formally discussed. I don't see if John's in the room or Glenn here, but I know John's certainly at IETF this week. I will try and speak to John Messenger. He's the 80.1 vice chair, just to try and, chill it along effectively. But it's relatively minor changes. It's not like anything huge. It's just sort of simplification of the model, but just want to check that they're happy with the names. So if they are, and I think through the IESG process, I suspect at that point they'll also check with 82.1 that they're happy. That's what happened with one of the other drafts.
Okay.
So I don't think formal liaison is required unless they ask for one, is mine.
And you participate in the coordination meetings that are going to be happening, so you'll bring it up.
Yeah, at various points, yeah. So
what's that?
at various places, yeah.
Yeah, so thank you.
Any other questions?
Yeah, just for your own information, we one of the biggest questions is what can we do to get this so that we can last call it. So it's good to hear we're making those steps. So as soon as you think you're ready, we'd like to know that.
Well, I guess the one question to you is we could potentially, not this one, but the previous one, we could do last call on that one now. I don't think there's anything stopping that at all, but it's probably easy to do the two of them together.
Yeah, if we're really close, it would make sense to do them together. Obviously, we wouldn't want to hold anything up.
Yeah.
If we come to the next meeting and we're in the same place.
We do that one.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
One technical comment, just flipping to your slides about the, go to the L2 VPN one. So, no, this is it. So is there anything you want to, have you raised this with the best group, and where do you stand?
I've raised it with the authors of that draft before the IETF, a couple of weeks ago, and they said that they were happy with the current structure. So I'm just going to wait to see where that goes to.
Current structure is there the way they have it documented, or the way you have it in the example?
Both. So my current example matches what they're doing.
Okay.
But it's in that example, when you look at the example thinking, actually, I'm not quite sure this looks as clean as it could do. And it's not on our Yang, it's on their side. So it's only informative rather than normative.
Okay. But for the chairs, is there any action you want us to take to help to try to align things, or you're happy?
No, I'm happy. It's their choice. And I just have to follow. I might need to update it if they change their mind.
Okay, thanks.
Okay.
I'll try to. There we go. Oh, yes, it is. Yes, it is.
Good morning, Kent. I'm presenting Yang data extensions. Actually, Martin put together these slides, and just click through them quickly. There's only two issues. The first is a naming issue. As you know, we're trying to migrate the RESTconf Yang data extension from the RFC 8040, and so we were originally going to call this extension also Yang data, but I think some felt that using the same name was leading to confusion and a different name might be better. So some ideas were kicked around. Currently, structure is out there. We're open to other ideas. As I know, very minor detail point, but now's the time to throw out ideas. I think just simply data would also be good. This is it.
So are you asking for objections, or are you asking for concurrence?
Well, I'm actually, either if anybody has any opinions, a strong opinion, either way. But if there's no objections, then I guess we'll move forward with structure because that's what's on the slide. And there's no objection in the room, let it be noted. And second and last issue, actually this is a holdover from before as well. Martin posted to the list and there was no response. So we're here discussing it in the room. So there was no agreement on the issue as to whether a structure must have a unique top level name or not, and of the syntax for augment Yang data. To resolve this, we proposed on the mailing list that the structure would be encoded like any data, that is with a container. So for example, if you're defining in your Yang the structure modifies description data store error info with a leaf reason, then you can see that the instance document would contain, it's like a container. So it has the outer envelope modifies description data store error info. Whereas the current, if it was the current Yang data structure, you would just see reason as being on the outside. So this is the proposal. It's actually a pretty large divergence, I feel, from the current Yang data structure. And in particular, I think many of you are aware that the zero touch draft is making use of that ability for the, that the Yang data, the name of the Yang data itself is not showing up in the structure of the instance data document. So if we were to do this, I'd have to update the zero touch draft to accommodate it. But beyond that minor detail, it's probably, well, I actually feel it's probably better long-term approach. Better to be explicit, to have the name of the Yang data or structure show up in the instance document directly, as opposed to it not. Any, are there any objections to this approach? Comments?
Rob Wilson, Cisco. So my only comment is whether that's going to make it not so nice to read effectively in the instance data. So I think it'd be useful to see this in context of how Yang data is going to be used, and whether that will actually mean that when you like augment extra data, I can't remember exactly where it's some of the use cases of it, but I wonder whether this is going to make that more ugly in terms of like the messages you're seeing, whereas before it wouldn't. That's my only concern.
I think the instance document you get is probably identical in the sense that the author, the Yang designer, can construct it still. Before, they would have to themselves put a container if they really wanted it to show up, a container with Yang RESTconf Yang data. It'd be the outermost would be a container followed by whatever you want inside. And now you don't have to put that outermost container. It's implicit.
So the question is,
so, but with augment Yang data, I think that's what you were saying. Now you need to reference this, and how would that show up in the augment XPath?
It was more that you're saying you get the container for free now, but what if you don't want that container to be there at all? Is my question, I think.
Do you have a use case for when the container would not be needed at all?
I need to look in the draft and have a look. So I might be thinking of a different use case.
Mm-hmm.
So unless I'm misunderstanding, the value I see here is that you can augment what's now called the structure. While before you couldn't augment the structure, you could only augment the instance, right?
I think that's part of it, but also this gives you, so there's a concern that for, how should I say, ambiguity showing up if there's multiple top level structures having the same name. And with the prior approach, it's actually possible that two different Yang designers may accidentally, I think through an augmentation, have the same name show up in the same namespace, and that was causing the problem. But with this, it no longer, it teases apart the ambiguity has disappeared. So I think both were motivations. So Rob, you said you would want to see more, so I think you would like to take this to the list and have it.
I'll have a look at the draft, and then I can comment to this on the list if I still have an issue with it or not.
Okay.
I tried to remember what the background of the history was of this issue. I think, was it Andy raising it that he had this namespace?
Yes, and actually, can you check Jabber, because I know Andy's on Jabber.
There's nothing there.
Okay. Yes.
I guess I hadn't necessarily bought into his concern, as in, and I thought realistically, would this really be an issue or not?
Mm-hmm.
And I just wonder whether this is going to make it harder to use in some way. That's my concern. So, okay.
Rashad from Cisco. Sorry, I haven't read the draft in more than a few weeks, but maybe a question for Rob. I don't understand his question, because if you don't have the outer container, you don't have a context. How do you know in what context foo is? Because I think, Rob, you were questioning whether that outer container is needed, right?
I mean, it might be I'm confusing with the augmented case. There's certainly a case where it feels like you don't want this container necessarily to be there.
If you recall in 8040, the description statement for Yang data said that it had to resolve to a single container or a container. And so this actually codifies that. You remember, in the zero touch draft kind of worked around that language and said, well, it does resolve to a container. It's just a choice of containers. And but this actually would remove that ability to even do the choice of containers. You would actually, so now you really just have that top level named structure.
Okay.
I don't know. It just makes it a little bit more explicit, I think, what was intended by the RFC 8040 description statement.
Okay, I think I'll go read the draft. I think I'll go and read the draft before I ask any more questions.
Okay, well, certainly with both of these, we'll confirm them on the list. And that is the end of the presentation. Thank you.
Just one comment to Ken's presentation. The Yang instance data draft starts with Yang data container whatever. So yeah, we are happy to use it.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I can't make it larger.
Yang instance data draft now is adopted, and I'm very happy to see that. Here. Okay. So just a very quick recap. We need Yang instance data offline sometimes because maybe we need the data already in design time before any device actually implemented it. Or maybe we need data that would come from a Yang server, like Yang library, but you don't have the relevant network nodes available. If you think about someone designing a management system that can handle 10 different types of nodes, you will not have all 10 nodes available and configured correctly. So yeah, you need instance data sometimes. These are some of the use cases, and these are just use cases. They are not normative in any way. That was clarified in the latest draft. Most important is documenting server capabilities. There, in the NetConf, there's already a draft about documenting notification capabilities that was adopted by NetConf that is already using this concept. But some companies, including mine, is already using such instance data for preloading default configurations. For example, access control, you could preload access control rules, which parts of the big data, the complete data model are available for different groups and roles. And there were some other use cases as well, which I'm sorry not to mention here. Yes?
Láďa Hutka. I think that this document goes into quite some length explaining all these use cases, but I believe there are other use cases. For example, we use instance data in RFCs as examples. We often validate instance data with tools, which means they must be in some kind of file or convert them to different formats. So I believe it's not necessary to provide more and more use cases, and because I think that it's quite undisputable that instance data can exist on their own. So I would suggest to shorten this part and simply mention some examples, because I don't think that anybody is arguing with the need of having some. And the fact is, for example, in RFCs, we had to use, with XML examples, we had to use some get replies or things like that, which is sort of stupid. So I think that it's quite clear that something like this is needed, and there is no need to have several pages of use cases or something.
Earlier, there has been some debate. Now I'm happy it's over, and I'll look into shortening this. While at least listing the use cases, I think, is useful even if in a shorter format.
I also think that, in fact, in the light of the discussion of Yang data, I believe that there is no reason why we cannot have just a standalone instance data that do not belong to any server or whatever. And then this is a use case just for using Yang without any Yang data extension directly on validating such use cases, because in this case, I don't see any reason for doing this Yang data wrapper and having a separate augment statement and things, extension and things like that.
Sorry, what do you mean by standalone? So I think you need a Yang model to define the structure.
Yeah, of course, but I can have some data like the Yang data extension is trying to address, and this is just some data that I need to validate. So I think that...
Yes and no, because yes, if you think about an example in RFC, yes, you are right. If you think about, let's say, a preloaded set of configuration of access control rules, then you want to say that this is the exact set of data and I need metadata connected to this, actually this set of data, so that I can identify when it's updated, when it's who's the author and a few other things.
Yeah, this is not related to this draft, so maybe you can...
Okay.
Mahesh Jetanandani. While I'll agree with Ladon that we may not need more examples, but I think it's important to understand where all the instance data can be used, not just as part of RFC, but also in how it gets packaged and distributed, along with the Yang definition itself. So yes, I would agree that we may not need more examples, but we need to at least understand where all Yang instance data can be used.
But I think it's definitely at least worth mentioning each of the use cases. So if I left out any use case, then I'm sorry for it, and then please tell me. Okay. So the basic idea is unchanged: reuse existing formats from netconf and restconf for a get operation or request, actually the reply for the get, and decorate it with instance data, which might not be needed if you are just showing an example in a IETF draft or IETF RFC, but often for the other use cases, it is very important to have this metadata added. We have the two formats, and there is a need sometimes to document both config true and config false data. If we are thinking about the CCamp alarm draft, there they will have a list of alarm types that a network node can send, which is read-only, but documenting it and potentially using it for populating the server with that data, it is still important to document read-only data. And yes, partial data sets are also planned. Yeah.
Again, I think that in some cases you can have a data model that contains both configuration and state data, and in some cases you just want to provide configuration, for example. as I understand it, this is not possible in your approach. I think that
It should be. I don't. Why do you think it's not possible?
because then you can run into if some state data somewhere is mandatory and it's not contained in the instance data that you provide because you just want to give configuration, then it can be somewhere flagged invalid. So
Sorry, no. Partial data sets are allowed, and in the draft it is stated that that means that any mandatory min elements constraints might be violated or allowed to be violated. So if you want, then you don't provide the mandatory parts, be it configuration or state.
I will probably ask in the mailing list, and I can give you some examples.
Please have a look at this. There's, I think, 3 constraints.
But I'm talking about something a little bit different. It's not about minimum elements.
Let's talk about it offline. But yeah, it should. The plan is to allow both configuration and state. And if you want, then you can provide only configuration or only state, or let's say full configuration with 30% of the mandatory state. Yeah. So the draft was adopted by the work group, and adoption was relatively close to the closing date for the draft submission, and there were some national holidays in Hungary, so I missed that deadline, but now it is submitted. But I think today it's pending on the work group chairs with such very late submissions.
Yeah, I think Kent did that already. I'll double check. But
Thank you very much.
yeah, he did it.
So yeah, it was my fault, but now then I needed your help now. Anyway, the last format, that last private draft that was stored is really the same as what will be stored as the first version of the work group draft. The name of the draft has changed, so that it really explicitly says that this is about the file format. This is not about how to use it and mandating any of the use cases. I very much hope that some of them will be mandated or recommended, and that I assume, and maybe I even work on it, that there will be a connected draft or that describes how to use this to document server capabilities. Actually, yeah, the netconf notification capabilities is one such draft. There have been some changes since the last IETF. Clarify the scope is the most important, and we added one parameter to define the data store where this data is intended to go. That might not always be necessary, so it's an optional parameter. Let's say if it's state data, then it's trivial that it goes into operational or into state data if you are non-NMDA. So we don't depend on NMDA at this point. So open issues. Some people stated that we might need more metadata, potentially metadata for each target Yang module. And this terminology, target Yang module, so the Yang module that defines the structure and content of the instance data, the real data that is put inside this wrapper. It depends on what kind of additional metadata we need. We might need this per target module metadata. The big question was, how do you define which version of the target Yang modules you are using? Which version of the target Yang modules is this set of instance data good for? And there is no good answer for this because the versioning team has not finished its work yet. Definitely just saying that revision date X, that's too strict. It will be the modules will be updated for a number of reasons, taking the most easiest just cosmetics, and we still don't want the instance data to be updated for every of these. So my proposal is indicate in the instance data the revision that was used when the instance data was last updated. If you combine that with compatibility information for the target Yang modules, then you have a very good view of where and this could be used. But giving anything more specific, I don't think is possible at this point.
Kent, as a contributor, and how would you do that to indicate which revision was used?
If you look, first open issue, have a list of target modules, which would not be needed that much because the namespace is already dictated. But if you want to include the revision date of the target Yang modules, then include a list of target Yang modules in the metadata, including their revision date. I don't see any better solution than that. Okay. The next question came up, yes, but whether this instance data set or instance data file can be used might depend on the features implemented by a specific implementation, specific network device. Yes, that is true, but then documenting revisions, features, deviations, we are getting into a lot of details, and we don't want to, I would say, don't want to replicate the full Yang library inside every instance data file. I see that you might rather say that use it together with that, or you rather say that if you get a bit more instance data than you bargained for because you don't support some of the features, then follow the compatibility rules and ignore that. Yes?
Rob Wilson, Cisco. So I think I don't know why I raise this or someone else. I think my aim here is to be able to say any server should be able to load an instance data document and have enough context in that document itself that it knows what schema to use is and what features need to be there. So that's what my aim is, so that you don't have to have extra metadata information around the instance data to be able to interpret that file.
I see, but I think revision and I hope revision and the compatibility rules, meaning that you ignore whatever data is there, but you don't know it, should be enough. If we say that that's not enough, then I would say rather say that for every instance data file, you need an associated another instance data file about Yang library and reference that. So don't reproduce the complete Yang library information in every instance data file.
Yeah, I don't think you need to. And again, I'm not sure with features whether you need to or not. You just assume that all features are available, might be sufficient. But it's just that's the aim. Is my aim is to say, look, I don't want somebody else to have to say, oh, well, to interpret this file, I need to have this extra information.
I assume yes, and I assume at this point that you can write your instance data for all features supported. And if some feature is not supported actually on a network device, then compatible ignoring or discarding of the additional data will work.
Yeah.
And there was another requirement that metadata, yes, we defined a very nice set of metadata, but there might be other parts needed, so augmenting must be possible. And I hope that Kent and Martin will solve that problem with the Yang data or Yang structure draft. And that's all that.
So I had one other comment actually, going back to the issue that Lada raised. I actually agree with Lada that it would be better to have the use cases section per se shorter. I think that it's still quite detailed for the individual use cases, and I'd rather those either move into an appendix or it just says, look, these are the things and how instance data could be used without describing in too much detail. Because if you write another draft on server capabilities, you've now got text in two places describing what those are, the conflict, potentially. I sort of feel that if we start that other draft, then that text can move there. And you just say, this is an example of how it could be used without having so much detail. Because I don't think it's key to the document. I think the key thing is really, how do you actually document the instance data?
I can make it shorter. I can make it shorter. Any other question? Thank you for your.
Yeah, so just so you know what's happening, the keyboard doesn't work on the laptop, so we're sort of stuck with the view that it's in.
Live debugging sort of performance art.
So one of the benefits, I'm Adrian, one of the benefits of doing what the chairs ask and submitting the slides in time is that the slides are out of date. So this is our fairly simple document on handling long lines in artwork, and it's now a working group draft. That's just you got it right. Yes, brilliant. So I can't read any of the slides. If that's too small, and that's
No, yeah.
my sort of stance. I tell you what, how many people are watching online? Put your hand up if you're watching online. Right, good. Pardon me for a couple of slides going over what's going on, that to set context. I think that's okay because we've just adopted. So what we know is that the format of drafts is a 72 character limit. Line feeds sometimes have meaning, in particular when they show up in XML and JSON, they actually have semantic. And that combines with the desire to include examples in our documents where those examples can be automatically validated and not confuse users who try and sort of cut and paste the examples into real use. That means that we have to do something to handle line feeds that are necessary in our examples. And we've actually got some examples that are in our documents that have gone out where people have hacked their way around this or written special cases. And I know from bitter experience, a lot of time is spent trying to construct examples that actually don't overlap the 72 character. So the other thing we need to know is that lots and lots of different tools and development approaches are used by different people. So there's never one size fits all. And if we scroll forward, so what we're trying to do is come up with a notation, a way of handling these examples with line wraps so that there's not confusion. And we'd like to be able to automatically wrap lines so that you can write your example in one nice legitimate piece of code and give it to a tool that will wrap it. But we also want to support creative people who like to do the wraps themselves and use indentation. And we also want to support native escape characters. So roll on. What we've done since last time, at IETF 102, we were at 06 of Kent's individual draft. Wrote these slides at 08, which was the version that was adopted. What we've changed, we clarified the scope a little bit. It used to say internet drafts, and of course it should apply to RFCs as well. And we've clarified that the primary intent is for formatted examples and code. You might use it for other things, but I think if you started to use it for tables and for real figures, you would cause confusion. We clarified that we are coding in Pascal and not in C. So the columns count from 1. This has caused us immense stress. We changed the header line format. The actual format of the header line used to instruct you how to wrap by the length of that line, and that was getting a little confusing. So we've gone to an explicit value for that. We've moved to a slash at the end of the line and a slash at the start of the wrap line, which I think was Rob's idea, so thank you, and that's quite nice. And the chairs are working out how to do the slides. This is cool.
Remember, we only have mouse.
Hey, if only...
By the way, we did figure out how to go full screen, but we can't get out.
If only you had a working group secretary to do it all for you. What else did we do? We clarified tabs. We added some text to separate the manual and automated unfolding. We put in a forward reference to XML to RFC version 3 because that's got a source code tag as well as the artwork tag that we currently used, and we beefed up the examples. So the current solution is pretty simple. When you fold automatically, you get to the line length that you want, you insert / new line and a / as the start of the next line. So automatic unfolding is really easy. You get to the end of the line, find a /, find a / on the start of the next line, and you can just strip out the characters and off you go. Because somebody might have done manual indentation, you also strip out any white space that you find before the continuation /. There are tricky cases that arise, and what we have said is that if you're doing automatic folding and you come across a tricky case, it is best just to throw an error and say, I can't fold this, rather than we make this solution really complicated and handle all of those cases. Tabs, as I said, we've clarified this. Vertical tabs, probably will never see them, but if we do, we fail to unfold, fail to auto-fold. There was lots and lots of discussion about what to do with horizontal tabs, and we ended up with this text, which basically says, note that you're not supposed to put tabs in artwork and source code anyway. And when you're automatically folding, you must either convert the tab into spaces or throw an error. We've stated that other use cases are not out of scope. So clearly we're NetMod, we work on Yang stuff. There probably are other use cases where it's useful, all sorts of code-like things, and we do not rule them out, and we hope that we are applicable to them, but our focus is clearly within the working group. We have a few small open questions. Some of the examples I think are a bit clunky, but if that's the biggest problem we have, we're doing just fine, and the authors will work to polish them. I have a question there, is the scripting in the appendix sound? And I believe that somebody's pointed out an issue to you, Kent. So
It's been resolved.
It's been resolved. Well, there you go. Kent is so efficient. The precise format of the header line might need looking at, but that's again a really trivial thing. We had some discussion about how to tell an auto forwarding tool how to wrap, and currently we default at 69, and we have a -C flag that allows you to set a different value. I think we're probably happy with that, but we just want to check. At the moment, if you were auto-folding, you would do no indent at all. We could add a flag that also tells you how to indent. If anybody's got a strong feeling on that, we might, but otherwise not. And we possibly need to talk more to the XML2 to RFC version 3 team. The poll ended, we got adopted, we need to tidy and polish. The authors think that we've been around this loop long enough, and actually we'd probably move forward to a working group last call pretty fast. So I'd encourage you all to be looking at it now so we can get it right before that. I propose that we should bounce this off some of the other working groups that we know do a lot of Yang, just so that they're all aware what's happening. Since they're the people that write Yang models, perhaps their input would be handy. Rob.
Rob Wilson, Cisco. So one question I have is, you have a mark at the beginning of the folded data to say the folded data is following. There's no marker at the end of the folded data. So how does the tool know when it finishes, where it's going to finish? Is that obvious?
Yes and no. So when you hit, folded, not. Good point. Yeah, so yeah, in the source, of course, you'd hit the end of the artwork or source code tag, so
Yeah.
that would be done. But yeah, it's a good point actually. When you don't want to plow on trying to unfold all the
Because you
all
might
the
have blank
text.
lines in there you don't know in the actual data, so I don't think you use blank lines to stop. So I think you might need something at the end.
Kent as a contributor and co-author, but we kept that explicitly out of scope. The framing of when the end of the artwork is, we took it out of scope for this. It was discussed in the list.
How does it work? Is my question.
Well, if it's the XML based, if you're parsing XML, you can just extract the XML
So
node.
Ken, no, he's talking about the finished document. So you've
Yes.
got a text file in
Correct.
front of you,
Yeah.
and
Well,
you're trying to work out how to unfold.
I know. Yeah. There's two answers. If you're looking at plain text, there's one answer, which is that we don't support it, and we took it out of scope. If you're looking at the XML, you can extract the node directly.
See, that doesn't make sense. So you can't unfold it if it's in a text document. The unfolding doesn't work. That defeat the purpose?
But it's not our problem to solve. It's a different problem. There are other artworks that are not folded, and they
Okay.
also don't have end of the artwork tag. It's not this problem.
Okay.
Yeah, so I think there's a place here where this intersects with how the IETF sees text, which is text is in the modern structure, text is rendered output. So it's not so much that text exists as a structure for anything beyond the convenience of the reader, right? And you actually sort of have to reach back towards the thing that actually has the structure in it, which is not the text document, to imply anything other than that this is rendered output.
So I agree with Rob and disagree with two of the three chairs. When I'm reading the text file, I reach the thing that says what you now have is wrapped text, and this is how you interpret the slashes. And then I get to the end of that piece of wrapped text, and I'm in normal text, and I encounter some slashes. I will interpret that to mean that I have to that it has been folded. So if I was a chair at this point, I'd say, let's take this to the list.
You have 3 minutes more to talk.
You don't want to hear me talk for 3 minutes more.
Kent as a contributor, just to add to that, in XML2 RFC v3, if you use the source code tag, it will automatically insert the code begins, code ends framing around our work that's rendered in plain text format. So again, this draft doesn't need to add any additional framing for the end of artwork.
So certainly the begin code, end code would handle the case. We don't get it in.
So this
in V2.
as you said, this is a good topic for the list. I think it's a very reasonable comment, and clearly we have some differences of opinion that we'll explore and see if we can get to some consensus, and then agree that Kent is wrong. But,
Can I just give one other example where this came up? Was I'd quite like to be able to use this for the tree output, effectively Yang tree output, and not necessarily generated automatically, but I have Pyang or Pyang when it generates it to be able to put this stuff in to wrap the lines. And again, there you wouldn't have the source code encoded. You'd normally just put those snippets in line effectively. So it might be another case where it would help.
so next we have.
Alex? Yes, comparison and view data source. And then immediately after another one of Alex's.
Try it. Yeah, try it. See what it does.
Great. So hello, everybody. So this concerns the comparison of an NDA data source draft. This is also a draft that went from since the last IETF has been adopted as a working group draft. We have only very minor updates on this. So again, basically just as a recap, this defines an RPC that allows to compare an NDA data stores to report only the differences without needing to upload the entire data stores. We just posted the working group version of this, which basically is pretty much the reposting of the earlier individual draft there. One of the items that was discussed on the list, which are not yet reflected on the draft, is to add support for the possibility of different encoding schemes, use different encodings to report back the differences. And basically the agreement there is that there will essentially be a leaf that will allow to specify which encoding is to be used. So just as a,
sorry, a question. What do you mean by an encoding? Just JSON, XML, or just the diff format?
The diff format.
So
it's how the diff format gets reported back, because I mean basically the thing is a Yang model, a Yang RPC. So clearly basically whatever netcon, RESTConf you use, that will
maybe apply. I would suggest, in order to avoid confusion, to use another word than encoding, because this is used in some way. And actually, I would also support in the future maybe developing some like more interesting format of the diff, which is something what Ken suggested, I believe, in the mailing list. Because in some cases, what you have here, the Yang patch, it can help you to transform some data into something else. But for example, if a user wants, or if a client needs to decide whether to use the original version or the new version and maybe switch between them, then this is pretty much useless.
So we'll get to it in a moment, actually, on the different point. But clearly, basically, the first item is basically to allow to have different possible encoding. That's the first thing. And then the second one is basically which one are basically mandated essentially in this draft. We'll get to this in one moment, so if we can just defer the further questions until we go to the slide after next.
As chair, generally, I try to suggest that we avoid options that are not strictly necessary or have a strong use case. So if the problem is that, as Lada was talking about, we have a format that's not really suitable for our general use cases, then we should fix that. If the problem is that we really have different options and we want to allow for that, then sure, different types is fine. But we should make sure we have a strong use case for different options, because if we really have these options, that leads to interoperability issues, because you'll get one implementation that does one thing, another implementation that does another, and if one's a client, one's a server, they can't talk to each other. So we only want to go to that option if there's a strong justification for it.
So that's a crux of the issue. So actually, let me just jump forward before going back in, since we are just on this issue. So basically, right now, what the draft specifies is to use the Yang patch format, essentially as this. But this does not include the values from both data stores, which would, however, sometimes be useful. Right? This is basically the issue that was raised on the list, and then therefore, basically in addition to just support the option to have your own, to add a new proprietary format, there's a question basically, should there an additional format be defined? There are basically two suggestions, I guess. The first one was to define an additional format that is not based on Yang patch. If such an additional format is defined, of course, there are some additional follow-on questions that will need to be answered subsequently, namely, which format should be the default, if any, right? Because we will have Yang patch, presumably, and this, and is there a format that is mandatory to implement? And basically, again, the whole issue about interoperability versus flexibility and implementation costs comes into play here with regard to that to that argument. And of course, the question is also whether this format definition should be part of this draft. So that was the first suggestion. Since then, there was also a second suggestion to simply basically actually augment the Yang patch edit list with an old value any data, and essentially address the format basically to having a better Yang patch format, if you will, and then use this simply as the one that is being defined in this draft here, and basically providing the augmentations there. This does appear to be the preferable solution, but obviously that is something that we need to discuss as a group. The reason I say it's maybe the preferable solution is because it ties very well with the existing Yang patch. And because it avoids having multiple formats and so forth, we find that as this draft. But anyway, that is one thing where probably we should get some feedback, comments. Let's see, Kent.
Yeah, Kent is a contributor. I'm not sure if I'd say it's preferable. Andy threw it out as a suggestion to make, to how we could extend Yang patch, and I said that it was on the path towards, the direction that we might want to go towards. But otherwise, I don't think we really had any sort of working group consensus around that. And then as chair, sort of echoing what Lou said or building upon that, I think the motivation for the previous issue, supporting multiple formats, Phil's motivation for that when he posted to list was because he perceived that the current format wasn't really a diff. It was like what Lada just said, it was actually just transforming from one to the other.
Yes,
And
for where there were diffs, yes.
Yeah, and so Phil's was sort of defensively thinking that, well, this means we'll have to do something later on, so let's ensure we have the ability to support multiple. But to Lou's point, if we actually pick the right thing now, we don't have to have multiple. The first issue disappears completely. We can just do the right thing now. And so with this, there's the opportunity.
Well, I guess there's a third case, though maybe it also respond to that. Yeah, that we would not define multiple formats in this draft. But of course, the question would still be, we might still keep the hook that would allow somebody to, well, we could define just one format here in this draft, and this is basically the one that's mandatory, but keep the hook that allows somebody to define their own additional proprietary format if they wanted to do, with this additional leap that was discussed. Actually, on this one, maybe I can just very briefly go to the previous slide, which basically shows the model structure, and basically for the format string that was discussed, this is basically, whoops, oh, sorry, what happened? This thing in red there, basically this little format leaf that would basically guide that output. Okay. Comments, Kent or Lou, you were making?
No, it's finish your point.
Okay. All right. Anyway, so that's, I think this is where we are at. This is really basically the main issue that needs resolving at this point. Other than that, I think basically what is in the draft is, well, it's fairly straightforward. It's not a big draft. And obviously, yeah, I think having one format and not a selection of formats is, I would also clearly think is clearly preferable because we want to achieve interoperability with this.
Vladia again. I would say there are some advantages to really permitting different formats. One is that this work can be delivered at least with some way of doing this diff which already exists. Otherwise, we would probably have to wait until this new diff format will have been developed, which can take some time, I guess. And second thing is that we may not get the new diff format right just immediately, and then there might be people that develop a smarter format later, and then it can be just exchange for it. So that's I would say more flexible, and I don't see any problem if at least the format can be somehow signaled using some capability or something like this, and it should be okay for both parts to agree on something.
Okay.
Kent is a contributor. So I agree with your second point, actually. If you're right, the diff format we select may not be optimal, and it's good to have a way to at least version, right? If we had versioning of the Yang patch and V1 could be one version, V2 could be a different, that's a different way of doing it as opposed to just having one version that internally had an ability to select different formats. So I think having an out of being able to support a different version later is a good idea. For the first issue, though, that you raised, I'm just wondering about the urgency of this. I do question that. I mean, I understand that NMDA came out and it's a good idea to have a diffing support, but is there really urgency that this matters if we're delayed by an extra quarter or two? I mean, can anyone speak to this?
Nadia, we have been discussing some in relation to my previous draft about RESTConf transactions. We have been discussing some kind of staging repository, and this diff format or diff capability would be useful for this. So, of course, this staging data store is still sort of remote thing at the moment, but I don't know. So are you suggesting that this draft is written without any concrete option for specifying the diff, or that we just wait with this work until the diff format is developed? I think it can take several years, maybe, because people will have different priorities. Of course, we know this, and everybody knows what a diff is. So I expect quite heated discussions and so on. In the plain Unix diff, we have several different formats that can be somehow emulated in this as well. So I'm a bit afraid it can take a long time. So at least we can do some work, and if we have some pluggable diff format, then we can work on that later and still have something.
So what I heard Kent suggest is that we try to come up with the right format. And then if that seems to be taking too long, or we can't reach agreement, then fall back to what we have available. Maybe I read a little too much into what you were saying, but I think that's a sensible course, is let's try to do the optimal. The optimal is a single solution. Let's try that. And if we can't get there, then fall back. So, I would personally, with Chair Hat, any hat, I would be opposed to saying that here's this one mandatory format, but you can do whatever you want later. I would say, here's this one mandatory format, and that's it. Because we already have a way of extending models. There's augmentations. If we come on and find something better, we find another one, that could be done, that extension can be done as an augmentation. But I think we should start out with one format, whatever that one format is. If we can define what we agree as a group would be a right format, let's use that one. If we can't, let's use patch. But let's at least try to get the right one.
Yes.
So shall we set a deadline on how long it can take to develop this format? And if we don't succeed, then we sort of back up to this, because I think it can still take quite a long time.
If the authors and the working group don't come up with a proposal, we'll have our answer that it's patch. If the authors come forward with a proposal, or someone in the working group, it's a working group document, anyone in the working group can contribute. If we come up with a proposal and we have some good agreement on it, it could be very quick. But we really have to see what kind of contributions we get in. And we could revisit it in one IETF, and maybe at the next IETF we have a great solution, a great proposal that we're all happy with, or maybe it's obvious that we have to stick with patch.
Kent, as a contributor, or actually as chair, sorry, just adding on to that, I think there's a caveat that there has to be good faith effort, right? They just didn't run out the clock. I mean, there's a certain amount of time until 104. I mean, actually has to be discussions on lists. If there's no discussions and we get to 104 and we're just having the same, that's not fair, right?
Yeah, Joel Yeagley. I mean, sounds like we have a milestone, but like all milestones, it's essentially aspirational. And if it looks like we're not actually on the way to achieving it, then we probably need to throw it out and do something else at that point.
Great. I think that's reasonable. If we get great proposals between now and 104, we'll see where we are with that. If we don't, we'll probably go down the path of just using patch.
So, Rashad, Cisco, question to you. When you were saying we find the ideal format, if we do we still go with the format leaf, or are you saying we do the augment later on if needed, if there's a better format?
Yeah, I'm not a big fan of in a standard putting opening the door for a future option when we don't know what that future option is. If we knew we had the future option or multiple formats and we think that we need it, we have a good use case, absolutely do it.
Okay.
But if we don't, they can worry about it later. We build our mechanisms so they're extensible, so we can do that extension later.
So you just for clarity, so you're basically saying basically that the earlier suggestion to add this format leaf, we should essentially remove that.
I would not.
This item here on this thing. So we basically just go back on what we.
I think you should have one format. What the one format is, we have to work through. As
one format and not the extension hook to leave it all.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Now,
right.
There's all sorts of alternatives that may come up when we find that we really do need multiple formats. The group says absolutely we need them, then we'll support that. There's alternate paths we can head down. We have to see where we go and what kind of contributions we get.
Rob Wilson, Cisco, I don't want to talk about format at all. I would like you to maybe add in filtering by origin metadata as one of the things you could filter on. And the specific use case that I'm concerned about is that as it's described now, the diff you provide is a raw diff between two data stores filtered by the schema between those two data stores. But if you had, for example, configurations coming in dynamically, DHCP addresses, that sort of thing, then they'll always flag up as being a difference that you may not be interested in. You may actually be wanting to know is what of the configuration have I put in by running or intended hasn't been applied. So I think if you filter by origin metadata, you may then be able to answer that question, or at least be able to answer that question of what configuration I put in has not yet been applied, because that might be what you're looking for.
Okay, yeah, that was actually, that particular item was one of the most motivating items to see where could even differences and so forth arise from. Okay, yeah, point taken. Try to filter. Okay, any other comments?
Sorry, just to clarify, so I wasn't so I'm not asking for the origin metadata on the output to know where the changes come from. I'm asking on the input to say, I don't want to see these changes. I don't want to see the differences that are due to learned configuration. I want to just see the ones that come from intended. Mm-hmm. So it's like a filtering parameter rather than necessarily an output one, but that might be a different question as well.
All right.
Kent, as a contributor, I think the output format should include a version number so that if we do ever version the patch format, the diff format, and someone were to obtain it out of band, they know which version of the diff format it is by looking at the version number of the header.
Version of the format itself?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Why would we need it if we mandate, if we say one format is mandatory? We're not including a hook to extend this and so forth. I don't understand why we would require that.
Okay, we can take this to the list.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thanks. Okay, good. So is this one next?
I think so. Did I go to the right one?
Okay, then I can just stay here. Okay, so the next is an update. This is basically not a working group draft, but I guess we're moving to the individual drafts now. This concerns the smart filters for push updates. Actually, the title is wrong. It's not a problem statement. It is the smart filter for push updates. We posted an update to this draft. It's one of the drafts which have been somewhat basically in a little bit dormant stage while we're working through the Yang push suite subscribe notification support to get to. But as those are basically nearing their completion, it's time to start actually taking up some of this other work again. So again, as a recap in Yang push, we provide filters that allow clients to select which nodes to subscribe to. However, the filtering that is based on values of those objects is currently not covered in Yang push. However, many monitoring applications are actually based on observing values. So they would want to know, for instance, okay, I'm interested in this only if, for instance, if it is in a certain range or above a certain threshold, and so forth. The reason to not include filtering based on values in Yang push was we did not want to stretch implementation complexity further. Yang push is already a fairly big draft, so we felt basically putting these types of advanced capabilities in there would basically unduly overburden this. So this is basically follow-up work. Also, actually, when going into values, one comes actually in looking at the use cases there, it's also clear that you get very quickly actually on a path that leads you to also requiring potentially state. Because one, for instance, with regards to being interested in for instance, if a value is above a certain range, basically this basically leads down the path of supporting the threshold crossing alerts, where you would want to be notified once the threshold has been breached, and then you don't want to keep getting notified. You want to only get notified perhaps if it falls below a counter threshold and hysteresis threshold, which again would require you to maintain state, and again this would add complexity. Anyway, so there is a gap if you want to have this type of functionality, and the smart filters draft basically tries to address this gap. In terms of updates, so as mentioned, basically the draft has been there for some time, but basically one thing that we did add, actually pretty close to General and Walker, who actually added this part, is to define the first set of filters. Those are value filters that allow to compare objects against the threshold using an operator, so greater than, greater, equal, less than, and so forth. And the semantic of the filter is then to push the update of an object only basically if the value basically matches the comparison, so basically if it passes the filter. It's not yet a threshold crossing alert in the sense that there's no state that is maintained. If you had the next push update in the next period and it matches, and again the threshold cross, you would basically resend. You would basically resend this update. You don't have a counter threshold or anything of that nature. So in terms of basically taxonomy that we also defined earlier, basically the filter that has been defined now has been added is basically the first item, like the first bullet item, filter based on values, and the stateful filters, aggregates of time, all the other items and so forth, those are basically still TBD. So in terms of next steps, yeah, basically, so clearly basically so this is basically the first set of filters. We want to grow the supported filter types. We want to add also stateful filters specifically to deal with the threshold crossing alerts, so the other type of threshold crossing, potentially also the high water and low water marks, and again assess interest of the working group if we should basically go ahead to define a solution for this problem. There was significant interest in the past. Again, given the Yang focus on Yang push, getting those things out, we waited there a little bit, but given the state of readiness now, it may be time to take this up again. And perhaps once these other drafts have gone through the shepherding reviews and are in ISG, then maybe at that point in time, we may also ask for adoption call, perhaps not now, but perhaps at the next IETF or so. Comments?
Yes, Michael from Huawei. Okay, I have reviewed your document, and I think I have several questions. First, I think this is useful, but do you think you need to define some more generic method to support different mechanisms, not just limited to the Yang push? That maybe it's more useful. I mean, define some generic method for the smart filter.
Yeah, well, so I think basically, well, I guess for in terms of what you could do, falls really into two categories. One thing basically where you have updates and you want to do something based on the values of those things. So you're not, and I think that one fits actually very naturally with Yang push. It is an additional capability that builds on top of that. However, your point actually, I think where your point comes in, is when you are not just filtering in terms of passing something or blocking something, which is what a filter does, but potentially aggregating this information into more things. And clearly, basically, there were also the question, okay, should we have things that define an average or that sum up things across a list and so forth? There are basically clearly items that you could take there. Those things go actually a little bit beyond Yang push, and there I would agree that is actually one question to whether those things should be defined here, and perhaps not, because one thing that is actually in gray in S&P MIBS, there was this concept of Armon, right? I mean, I think many people here will remember. So basically, that would not be a substitution of Armon, right? So basically, in Armon, you would have basically these these aggregates, the top 10 lists or whatever and so forth you could define of different things. So we would not go into that direction. That would go, so for those types of filters or pre-processing and so forth, what have you, that would be outside the scope of this draft.
Okay, you mean you'd like the most clear scope. Okay. Another thing, okay, I think there's some kind of work we propose event management young data model, and we also some blog maybe similar to this works and define some filters and reference some MIP definition. And I think maybe we can discuss more and then work together and maybe improve each other's works and
Sure.
find some way to harmonize each other. Okay.
Yeah.
So I think you have some slides on a related
Yeah.
topic, and you're actually up next.
Yeah.
So I
Okay.
think maybe you're setting yourself up, and so maybe it would be good to switch over to that, and you can talk to not only with the slides you have prepared but how you might generalize them to support this case as well. And then we have another document after that that also might be related depending on where the authors want to take it. So it seems like it might be to consolidate discussions. Before we move on to that, let's just see how many people in the room have read this draft, the current draft. So if you've read this draft, so that's a few, but not a huge amount. We'll ask the same thing of the next two drafts. Michael, don't go away. If it's quick, ask. If not, we'd like to maybe have more discussion once we've heard the next two drafts.
I guess there's a couple of quick comments I don't know. So one of them is I quite like this draft. I like the idea of filtering in a stateless way. For the stateful filters, I wonder whether those sorts of things aren't better put into the data models directly and handled separately. I think you gave some examples of other cases like ARMON, for example. I think for the things where those matter, maybe it's better to put that into the data model than having a generic mechanism. The last one is, I wonder whether if this does progress, whether it should be done in NetMod or NetConf, because that's where the other drafts are.
Well, actually, as author of the NetConf or notification capabilities draft, I was wondering, your idea is that, let's say, someone who implements these filters, will they implement it for everything, or will they implement it for everything that supports push change, or is a subset of that?
Well, so okay.
Sorry.
Where should we go into the okay? Your question basically, does it impact the capabilities? Actually, I'm not sure. I think basically this is, I mean, if you view this really basically as an additional filter that you would apply on top of Yang push, and this is basically where this is positioned now. You would basically apply the filter to the output from the Yang push and maintain the things from that way. So from that perspective, it should be applicable across. So basically having differentiated capabilities to say, I support the filter for object A, but not for object B, I don't think that would be required here. Maybe if we go into some of the stateful stuff, might be a different story, but certainly for the stateless filters, also basically the first set of filters that is defined now, I would think this is, that would just be generally applicable.
Let's pick this up on the list. We're running a little
All right.
bit.
Thanks.
Good morning, working group. This is Michael from Huawei, and today I want to introduce a young data model for event management. Okay, why we want to propose this document is because we want to support some, provide some mechanism to support closed loop automation management of data collection and network optimization. Our idea is to monitoring the young instance data, and if this incident data have met some condition, then it can trigger some action. For example, send a notification or do some reconfiguration. So we propose this document and define a young data model for an abstract event management, and provide the ability to help user to monitoring the young instance data, to define some condition, to define some triggered action. Okay, this slide provide what is provide what is an event. For my view, okay, the event is something just happened when which is interesting or triggered by some rules. And we also think the events may be very large scope definition. Many things can be defined as an event. For example, unfold or learn, or some change in network state, or just some network security threat like this. So we think maybe we can find a mechanism and help the user to automatic measurement this event and do corresponding action. And here is some event examination example, and slide present several events. For example, if some service want to be implemented and it need to set up some tunnel. Here we define event like, okay, we set up a tunnel from side A to side B, and so the target may be, okay, here is a young instance, the tunnel name is A to B. And if this tunnel be set up successfully, so it can trigger a corresponding action. The action is, okay, we need to enable some function such as monitoring the tunnels A to B's. And this action may be also involve a set of another event. For example, event B is to monitoring the the tunnel's lost packet number, and the target is, okay, this is tunnel's name is A2P, and monitor is his lost packets. And if the lost packet number cross some threshold, then it can may send a notification and also trigger another action like automatic set corresponding value, for example, switch path. And another event may be monitoring the tunnel's state. And if the tunnel state, the tunnel down, it can send a notification to the client and the customer, okay, this is the tunnel down, and maybe trigger another event. The event told him, okay, you need to do some active standby failover. Okay, this slide shows our solution. We define this young data module. Can you help me to? Okay. This young module previously have three blocks. It have event to present the event name and event type to distinguish different event, and event type can easy extension, and you can based on your interest in to define what kind of event are you interested in and you want to management. And another second block is a trigger. It defines the set of triggers function condition, such as frequency trigger or some filters. The filters we based on the event event MIP to borrow their conception of their triggers condition. I define some three kind of filters, such as existence. If some young instance appears, then it can trigger and maybe notification and trigger or recuperation. And the Boolean condition, if the corresponding young instance data equal to some parameter or threshold, it will trigger corresponding action. And the threshold filter is help you to compare different different value of between this sample and previous sample. If it crosses the threshold, it will trigger the corresponding action. And the third part is action. Action is provided three kind of action. First, you can send the notification, and another you can do this inline action and do some reconfiguration works. And also it can trigger another event. It can help to do some closed loop automation, closed loop management. Here is some gap between the event document and previous work, such as Young push. And here, the table shows what's different between the Young push and event Young. And the trigger condition previous Young push have two conditions. First is periodic push and unchanged push. And here we, based on the event map, we define three kind of filters: existence, Boolean, and threshold. And the notification, obviously, there are two methods can support the notification. And here, our document also can support automatic reconfiguration and trigger another event. The next step, would you like to solicit more comments and improve our solution document? Okay.
All right. Thank you. In the interest of time, I'd like to ask you to work with the other authors and see if there's ways to align your work and report back on list.
Yeah.
I know that some drafts like Alex's is more focused on a particular problem, but it may be that this type of approach is more encompassing and can support both. So
Yeah.
thank you.
Can I make a quick comment?
Please.
Yeah.
So, I think basically this is in terms of consolidating, I think this is actually a very large draft. So basically, clearly the scope is larger, so I think it complements each other, right? Because one thing is clearly what you want to do on the events, but for the whole actioning part, the automation part and so forth, I think that is clearly something that would be, that is new in this draft, that should not go into any.
Sure, but he
aggregation
included
thing.
an action of notification, right? So, and yours was about notifications, right? Your action
Well,
is notification.
Okay, so if you say filter is an example.
Filter
of
result.
action. Yeah. All right.
And you guys can talk to each other and decide that, the suggestion is utter, is not applicable and come back and say that. That's okay.
All right, sure. You have. Mhm.
Morning, everyone. My name is Qin Wu. First, I'd like to introduce this draft and MDA-based event. This draft has been around for a while. That it early was presented in NetCall for twice, and this based on discussion in last meeting, we agreed to move this draft to NetMod. So here we give update of this draft. So this draft actually we define three NMD-based events. The first two events actually to indicate the start time and end time of configuration that apply from intent. And the third event actually is to keep track of the intent apply configuration data, that some of configuration data is not applied, some configuration data maybe is applied from intent, so we can actually to keep track of these intent applied results. If it is not applied, we will actually give the reason, and also we will give a list of objects that is not applied. So the change compared with the previous version, actually we add two new events based on the many-list discussion. And we also do some polishing, restructuring for this draft, and we narrow down scope to focus on the NMD specific event, actually only cover the configuration data that is applied from intent. Also, we consider failure handling case in our young model. For example, in some cases, if it's fair to apply the conversion from intent, we will actually give the warning, report the error information using some building block. So this is the model, what the model looks like. Actually, very simple model. Actually, we define the 3 event notifications. The first one is intent supply start. Actually, this we also carry some session information. This is session information inherited from the netcov session start that defined in obviously 6470. And for intent applied end, we add additional information to report the complete status to indicate whether it is get success or whether it is fair. So we use the error option that is defined in the RESTconf specification. That is actually a RESTconf IETF-RESTconf.young model. And the most important part is NMDA intent applied event notification. This actually we can leverage the NMD diff and to detect which object is applied, which object is not applied, and we can actually to report the error information if some configuration is not applied from intent. So here show the data store, the working flow, and also relate the base event sequence. And we can see the 5 netcov base event has already been defined in obviously 6470, and they can indicate the start time and end time of netcov session. So for the intent applied start and intent applied end actually take place between the netcov confirm commit and netcov session end. So for the intent applied start actually almost send at the same time as the confirm commit. So for the NMDA intent apply actually can happen at the same time as the NMDA applied end. So for some issue, we have some offline discussion with the cursor. Actually, it's about whether we really need this intent applied start, because the reason is actually intent applied start is sent almost at the same time as confirm commit. So also it is very expensive to send this start event message every time you do the commit. So we think maybe we have 2 options to address this. The first option is we just leave it optional and turn it off when it is not needed. Another option, we just drop this event. So this job that has been around for a while, we think is good shape. We like solicit feedback, and that's it.
Kent as a contributor. Just can go back to the previous slide. Yeah. Where does the intended applied event get sent? Is it after intended has been applied to operational?
You mean start actually is sent at almost at the same time as netcov confirm commit.
No, I'm not talking about intended applied start.
Yeah.
I'm talking about the last one.
Oh, last one.
Intended applied. Is that last one sent after it's been applied to operational?
Yeah.
Okay. And to the question regarding the usefulness of applied start event, I guess it would be useful for any clients that are not the one that, that's that initiated the commit.
Yeah.
Right.
Okay. Yeah.
Rob Wilson, Cisco. So my one question is, I don't know whether the applied start is useful or not. Probably it's okay, but if there's another notification to already provide that same information, it's probably not worth sending 2 different notifications at the same time. I didn't understand why there's 2 separate notifications for the completion of the event. I was wondering whether you could just have Because you've got one that's saying intended applied end and also NMDA intended applied. So do you need two notifications there? Do they come at the same time or are they separate?
Right now, we actually separate. We use the intended start and end to indicate the start time and end time. But the original proposal, actually, we think we can use one single event notification to indicate the end time. So, that's what we designed in this draft, in the current draft.
Okay. I mean, I think it might be more useful just to have one. This is the end of that configuration operation, and the result is either it's succeeded or it's failed, and it's failed. This is why it was not applied or something. So merging those two might make more sense. But I think this is probably a useful thing. So
thank you.
Kent, again, just quickly, I think the picture is probably the arrow, you need to put the arrow to another place, but also the names may be misleading. You could just simply call it intended updated and operational updated.
Yeah.
Right, as the events.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thank you. Yeah.
So again, continue the discussion on the list.
This one?
Well, the technical discussion. How many people have read the draft? All right, so a little more than the last one, but not much. I think we need a little more review on this to move it forward. And I'm not sure there's any commonality in this notification with other notifications. So I think it's a little too different. So,
yeah, a little different.
Yeah, a little different. So, yeah.
One more comment to this. I have seen systems which have some kind of auto commit feature where a big transaction will be broken down to many small commit transactions. In this case, sending so many notifications would be problematic. So there is a need to be able to switch this feature off, even if it's supported.
Or establish filters, maybe?
Okay. Jason Stern, can you go back to your flow diagram?
I would like to move that to the list, just because to be fair to the other presenters, who includes the next presentations.
Okay, thank you. So the second one is the factory default setting. So this is again. Actually, we also move this draft from netconf to netmod. The reason is this is NMD related. Also, it's transport independent. So that's we do this. So the goal of this draft, actually, we want to introduce a new method to reset the young data store into the factory default contents. And to realize this goal, actually, we define one new RPC option we call the reset data store. In addition, we define the factory data store. It's actually this kind of optional data store. So the reason why we introduce a new RPC operation, actually, we investigate all the existing netcall protocol operation. Already, we have delete config and discard change. But delete config can only reset the startup data store, but cannot reset the running data store. For the discard change, you can copy the running data store contents into the candidate, but actually, it cannot be actually to reset the candidate store without the change the running data store. So that's the dynamic data store. You cannot reset these dynamic data stores. For RESTconf, actually also apply here. You cannot reset. Yeah. So the new RPC we introduced here is we use this RPC to reset contents of target data store to its factory default setting. Actually, we use the data store as the input as the parameter. So when we were so the method we document the factory contents, we have many ways actually. The typical way is actually we can use running or stop candidate as the contents of the factory. If the factory data store can be defined or exist. But in some other way, actually, we can use young instant data to document the contents of the factory data store. And in some other cases, maybe we can define a set of the module that can be loaded on loaded by the factory, for example. But the problem is different vendor may have different solutions, so it's kind of implementation specific. And for also dynamic data store, actually, we like to set it just empty, So this is a new data store we introduced. We call the factory data store. And for this data store actually is read only. So it cannot be changed by the netconf, resconf for operation or CLI. But it need to be reset by the young server in implementation specific manner. And it also actually is optional data store. That means actually the reset the data store RPC can be performed, can be revoked without this data store. And for the managing operation, actually, unlike the staff data store, actually, it cannot automatically propagate automatically to any other data store. Also, usually it is static, actually, but in some cases, you may based on the hardware based on the hardware availability, and you may actually make some changes. This is based on comments from the Yugen on the list. Actually, we address his comments with this text. So this current status, actually, this draft moved to the net mode. Actually, the change we made is we restructure the document and make it more solid, and we also remove the netconf capability identified based on the many discussion, and we also add Blast as a new cursor. And two minor open issue actually is how it related to restart, how it related to the reboot. Actually, for restart, we already have a system management module. It defines the system restart. We can reuse it. So we also think restart is not needed. For reboot, we also believe is not needed. But if any folks think it's important, we can actually reconsider. So we think this draft has been around for a while and had a lot of support on the list. We like to request the working group adoption. That's all. Thank you.
Any questions? Rob Wilson, Cisco. So I was just discussing here that it might be useful to also talk about the copy config RPC that's defined in netconf, which you could potentially use as well to copy the contents either from factory data store to running configuration, which may not mean that you don't want to have your RPC because you've got other reasons for wanting that, but you probably want to at least describe saying you can also use this mechanism and it's equivalent.
Yeah, we also actually talk about that. Feel a little bit struggle because we move to the net mode. We need to clean up and make it transport independent. That's why we remove the copy config augmentation. But in the early version, we did have copy configuration augment extension for factory default setting. Yeah.
Why does it need to be extended? Why doesn't it just work today?
You mean just reuse the existing copy config?
Yeah.
So do you, what do you suggest? You want to document this in this draft?
Yes, that's what I suggest. I think copy config just works.
Okay. Maybe Balazs can have it.
So Balazs as a co-author. Copy config, as I remember, doesn't work because there the target is a choice of the three data stores. You need to extend it. And we wanted to have reset our data store because we want this to work even without an MDA. And once you have reset data store, there's really no need. Yes, we should describe that copy config is not updated because we don't see the need, but I don't think we need to, there is a need to include it.
Kent is a contributor. The RPC that you defined, reset factory data store, is that it? I think the draft should be clear that that's different than resetting the device to factory default.
Yeah.
Because there's more things that could change when you're resetting a device to factory default.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah. Great.
And
how many are interested in this topic at all? That's a reasonable number. How many people have read this draft? It's also a reasonable number, less, but a reasonable number. How many people think we should adopt this document as the foundation, as the starting point for our work in this area? And keep in mind that adoption is the starting point, not the ending point, so changes are possible. That's a very good number. So that's about the same number as the people who have read it. Any strong objections? None. Okay, so thank you. We'll discuss it on this.
All right, last presentation, right on time. Got 10 minutes. Wow, right on time.
Hi, so I'm William Lupton, and I just want to give an update on what we're doing with Yang work in the Broadband Forum. I think I last spoke at the Prague meeting, so it's just an update really. So just a quick outline, I won't go through that. Those are the things I'd like to talk about briefly. Moving on to the next slide. Sorry, can I move this down a little bit? Or no, the previous one, sorry. That one, yeah. Okay, so the emphasis, what do we work on? So we work on addressing BBF requirements. You know, that's the thing that drives us. You know, we're not trying to provide a general solution for the whole world, but of course we are trying to make what we use, what we provide generally applicable, you know, in the context of particularly the access network. So that's a little bit of a contrast between us and what I might call a core SDO that owns a technology and wants to provide a solution that will be used absolutely everywhere for all applications. It's particularly, as I said, the access network. The requirements that drive our models come from, I guess, the key standards are those documents that I mentioned there. And also, particularly now, there's this work called Broadband Access Abstraction, which Tim Kerr is very involved in, is producing also new requirements for young models. So we define stuff to address what we've defined, and we also define stuff to address what other organizations have defined, but where they're not interested in defining the models. So for example, quite a lot of our models are actually for ITUT standards. How do we work? Well, we like to import and augment other organizations' Yang. For example, IETF interfaces is definitely the core, and IETF interfaces in hardware are definitely the core of our models. But sometimes we can't do that. There's no standard Yang, or else there is standard Yang, but it's for some reason we can't use it. Perhaps it's too much of a big lump. There aren't enough optional features. Too much would have to be taken on board for it to be used. Or maybe there is sort of another example of the same thing. Maybe some nodes are mandatory, but that are just not mandatory, at least for our applications, or shouldn't be mandatory in our opinion. So if that happens, then you know, not Broadband Forum, because Broadband Forum, you know, can't work directly in another organization, but our members may well work directly in other organizations. So for example, the two main examples of that in IETF at the moment are contributing to the IETF alarms work. We have a lot of alarm requirements, and several of our members have been very active in that work, which is happening in CCamp and is nearing last call. And also there's some requirements for IP fix that we have across several of our standards. And we feel there's need for new IP fix models, and so some of our members have put in an individual submission for that, which I'm going to mention in a little bit more detail at this afternoon's ops area session. As a last resort, we might address our requirements internally, but as I say, that is a last resort. Okay, I won't go through this in detail, but there's just a couple of slides showing our active projects, and on the right in the status you can see which ones have been published, and those hieroglyphics of A1, A2 and so on, they're just different amendments. That's just to show that there have been several different versions of some of those. The next slide, just again, I won't go through, but shows roughly what some of the main things that are covered by the models in those different projects. Moving on to publication. So we have a release registry that lists all of our published software, which includes all of the draft and standard Yang. All the Yang is published to a public GitHub repository, a BBF one, but it's also in the Yang models, Yang repository as a submodule, and it's also all in the Yang catalog. So we're really trying to make this available and sort of, you know, act as a good member of the community. What are our external dependencies? First, as a matter of policy, whenever possible, all of our modules must use standard external modules, typically as a starting point, a building as the base to be augmented. And that means that means, you know, understanding how they're supposed to be used and using them in the letter and the spirit of how they're intended to be used. There are the published IETF modules that we're already dependent on. Nothing surprising there. I think I've already mentioned the alarms and don't need to say anything more about that. On best practices, we have our own best practices document, which is essentially an extension of 8407. We will incorporate aspects of other SDOs as we become dependent on them. I mean, IEEE is going to be the next one, but we're not yet, none of our modules are yet directly dependent on any anything other than IETF externally. And we intend to make these guidelines public. We'll publish them via a set of GitHub pages on that same repository, our Yang repository, but that hasn't happened yet. So final slide. I thought you might be interested to know what we're doing about NMDA. So we're still discussing it. Of course, the real world, many of our models were defined and published before it came along, and we can't control when people are going to switch, when implementers are going to switch. So we do have to continue to support both NMDA and non-MDA. I mean, it's a similar situation to what happens internally within IETF, of course. So the final sort of outer bullet, sort of non-binding sneak preview of some of our thinking. Firstly, this might seem controversial, but we feel we still need to stick with the non-MDA IETF interfaces as our sort of base, even though we know there is the, I forget the number, the updated 8400 and something. We know, we are aware of that. For the IETF hardware, well, it was only ever a draft that was non-MDA, so we don't have a choice there. So obviously, we've switched already to referencing the hardware. We actually deferred publishing some of our modules until the RFC was out there, so as to avoid referencing a draft. And if and when we update our modules that are currently using 7223, and also for modules that are what we call standalone, meaning modules that we define which are not dependent on IETF interfaces or IETF hardware, then we will, for example, when we're updating a module that's dependent on the interfaces, we will follow, or we think we'll follow, the same IETF guidance of defining a separate state module. But when they're modules that are standalone, then we're still not quite sure what we'll do. We could define a deprecated state tree, but we're a little bit more inclined not to have two trees, but just put augmentation straight into the single tree where we see the need of it in order to support non-MDA usage, you know, in order to support implementations that don't yet support NMDA. Okay. Any questions?
Oh, you were going to have one, but he walked away. Thank you very much. Appreciate the update.
Yeah. Okay. Thanks.
So we'll be, this is the end of the first session, first NetMod session. We have a second one on Thursday in the afternoon second slot. Look forward to seeing you there, and thank you.